consultant, a lawyer by training, and my background, other than being a lawyer, is working for the Hawaii State Courts on access issues, including language access issues. So I'll start with Suzanne, who's the chair of this conference. Has that already been mentioned, that she put this together? Thank you. She's on the faculty of the University of Hawaii Center for Interpretation and Translation Studies. She's not only on the Language Advisory Council, she's also on the Supreme Court Committee on Court Interpreters. So Suzanne. And then next to her is Cindy Shimomi-Saito. She is the Crisis Program Manager of the Sex Abuse Treatment Center of Kapiolani Medical Center for Women and Children. I'm just going to give you a really brief 1-minute overview of what we're going to do. We've broken this up into 3 parts. The first is lessons from the field, and that will be half an hour. After that, we'll talk about practical barriers to providing language access, and then so what now? Those of you who are not translators or interpreters, how many of you know the difference between the two?
I don't know.
How many of you do know? Did I ask who do know? Okay, how many of you don't know the difference between the two? Okay. Not willing to admit. Okay, Sue, it's all yours.
So a translator is taking one language and translating it into another language, but it's written form. So in the profession, we say you want a translator. That means you want someone who can translate a written document into another written document. An interpreter is oral translation. So if you call and say, I need a translator, you might get the wrong thing if you really mean you need an interpreter. So an interpreter, again, is oral translator.
Sue had asked me to talk a little bit about how the 3 of us got to know each other. We had worked together to develop a sexual violence training, or training on interpreting for victims of sexual violence. And that was a 1.5-day training.
It has to be closer.
Oh, it has to be 1.5-day training that the 3 of us had worked on together. It included everything from interpreting from the start, whether it's a call to the Sex Abuse Treatment Center hotline or with police, and then working the way through the system, meetings with counselors, meeting for the medical exam, interviews with police, and all the way meetings with prosecutors, and then all the way through to the court system and even to sentencing afterwards. So in some ways it was really an unusual training because it walked the interpreter through the entire process. One of the things that I had an epiphany when I was after working in this field for a really long time. One was that sort of the words and the feelings and the thoughts that happen at the community interpreting stage were really just as important as the court interpreting stage. So I think people tend to think that because the court is so formal, that accurate interpreting is really important, and they tend to think that it can be a little more lax in the early stages, when in fact accuracy is important, was really important in the beginning, because it could actually harm the victim later on if there's bad interpreting up front. And certainly in the medical area, it was really important to have accurate interpreting. The other was that there really is a slight difference but an important difference between community interpreting and court interpreting, and the function of the interpreters in those 2 roles. And also because there are so many meetings by service providers in providing services to the clients, there are a lot more opportunities for interpreters to develop relationships with the clients, apart from the interpreter relationship. And so this really ended up being a much larger issue when it came to interpreting for service providers. The 3 of us come from really different perspectives, and Cindy's going to talk about her own epiphany next. But you have Sue, who's the interpreter and trainer or educator. You have Cindy, who's a direct service provider and administrator, and I come from a government agency. So I will let Cindy talk about her epiphany now.
I was asked to be a part of this panel today to share with you our experience and our process at the Sex Abuse Treatment Center as we participated in the interpreter training that Du just mentioned. It was quite an experience and actually quite eye-opening. Prior to our involvement in the project, language access was very simple in our heads. It meant that if you had a client who did not speak English well or who had limited English proficiency, you needed to call an interpreter. The interpreter would come and service provision would proceed as normal. We held on to certain assumptions. We assumed that the person who was going to respond as the interpreter was trained and was skilled in interpreting. And perhaps because of this training, we assumed that the interpreter would understand his or her role as the interpreter and the boundaries of that role. We assumed that the importance of confidentiality would be known and that confidentiality would always be upheld, and that the material that we needed to convey to our client, being from the Sex Abuse Treatment Center, inherently you have sexual material. And we assumed that all the concepts of sexual victimization, everything that we needed to convey was accurately communicated to our clients. And we assumed that the interpreter would be a vehicle for us to better be able to communicate with our client who didn't speak English well, and they would be our assistant in this way. When we participated in the training, as I got more involved with the interpreters, what I realized was that there were many, many very good interpreters. But I also realized that some of the assumptions that we held on to were not always correct. It's not safe to assume that just because you have somebody who is functioning as an interpreter who would come and respond to our need, it wasn't safe to assume that they were trained as an interpreter or that you could assume a certain level of skill. And it's really hard as a service provider because, here we are communicating what we need to our in our case, our victims of sexual assault. And sometimes it's not quite right because you're there speaking for about, the interpreter and the client speaking for 5-10 minutes, and then she turns around and she'll tell me, oh, she said yes. So it's kind of obvious that something's amiss, something's not quite right. But other than that, we really, unless it's obvious like that, we're really kind of in a position of having to trust that the interpreter is communicating what we need communicated, and that's not often so. What I also learned through this project was that not always do interpreters maintain the boundaries and stay within their role. I learned that sometimes they went out for lunches, or sometimes they became the sources of transportation, or they developed friendships. And this was mind-boggling to me because I thought that just what happened in our session was all the contact that the interpreters would have with our clients, and that wasn't quite so either. We also learned that the assumption that the material was being appropriately or accurately or competently conveyed wasn't always the case, and often not because of the lack of skill of the interpreter, but because in certain languages, the sex assault information is not easily translated or is not, able to be conveyed in this other language. But I think the most eye-opening thing for me was that I didn't realize the power or the control an interpreter could have over a client and a service provider-client relationship. Oftentimes, depending on who you had as an interpreter, that person could actually take control or could color that contact so greatly, could take it down a different direction, could insert his or her own opinions and thoughts and advice and all of that. And that was just mind-boggling to me because as a service provider, it's usually just me and the client. And when you have the third party there, the interpreter, it's very, it can be very different. And it really pointed out for me how vulnerable I was as a service provider and how vulnerable our clients were to the skill and the competency and the ethical behavior of our interpreters. So needless to say, I left the project and this whole endeavor very kind of overwhelmed and feeling like, oh my goodness, what have we been putting our clients, what kind of situations have we had been working with all along? So I went back to the center, and it was really the beginning for us of looking at ways of better working together with interpreters, really joining forces in understanding that if we really wanted to bring quality care and quality service to our clients, we want it for everybody, not just those who speak English. And to do that, we really needed to become aware and start to do this very thing, begin to share our expertise and knowledge.
It was really great for us to realize how little that service providers or people who use interpreters or need to do language access actually know. So we realized there was this huge need for awareness because you really don't know what you don't know.
And actually, the more you know, the more you understand you don't know.
And it is this overwhelming feeling once you start realizing how much there is to do. The reason I begged for months, and well, actually both of us begged Cindy for months to be on this panel, and she said no, 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 and we finally got her to do it. And the reason I thought it was really important to have her on the panel was because the Sex Abuse Treatment Center has really dealt with the language access issue in a way that's novel, I think. They wanted to provide services to their limited English-speaking clients regardless of what the law said. So they were really looking at what is the most effective way to provide language access services. They weren't even thinking in terms of what their legal requirements were.
We didn't know there was a law.
So, you know what, you're going to hear this theme, I guess, throughout our presentation, that it's not merely complying with the law that you need to do. What you really should be doing is looking for the most effective way to serve your limited English-speaking clients, because if you're putting energy into just complying with the law and you're not making it any better for your LEP clients, then you're wasting your time and you're wasting your money. So you're going to hear that theme repeatedly during this panel, and that's why we wanted Cindy to be on this panel so much. Sue, do you want to talk?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm coming from an educator point of view, I guess, of perspective, and where a lot of the focus in education used to be on conference interpreting and interpreting for international conferences, the United Nations, and things like that. When in the last 10 years we've realized, at least from the education point of view, that, well, what is community interpreting? Well, that's, community interpreting. That's just question answer stuff. But we realize that it's very critical, because without training, and most of the interpreters, I think, were just kind of pulled into the interpreting situation by a friend or a relative that said, hey, I'm going to the hospital, can you come with me? Or I'm going here, can you come with me? And even a couple days ago in the courtroom, I saw a Korean person stand up, and his friend stood up next to him and said, and the judge said, who are you? Well, I'm his co-worker, I'm his colleague, and I'm here to help interpret. And of course he wasn't interpreting. And then we happened to have an interpreter in the courtroom, which was good, so she stood up and took over. But that's how I think a lot of community interpreters got started. So they really were self-trained, and in the critical situations such as sex assault or even just health or the courts, we know how important that is, but I think the education side of it was very slow to catch on. And that's why, for example, even at our Center for Interpreting right here at UH, we're focusing so much more in the last few years on community interpreting and the need in this community. And so a lot of research, I think, all over has been put into this. But what's scary is that when I got involved in this task force, I guess it was, listening to the police or the prosecution attorney or the agency, the service providers, I'd say, your interpreters are doing what? They what? And I was just like, I was blown away. And then I started going to different sessions and actually watching how interpreters, and I felt sorry, because I know a lot of interpreters were, and I'm saying interpreters because we're really talking about the communication, the oral communication here. But I was kind of felt sorry because I realized a lot of them were self-trained. They were put in that situation. They realized that they had a gift, I guess, of languages, and they're willing to use it. But the training, no one was ever trained, and no one ever told them that they needed to be trained. And so I think that's where that's where a lot of, where I'm coming from again, is that I'm glad that in Hawaii we are doing training. I've done numerous workshops at different agencies and nonprofit, I think mostly nonprofit agencies, and training with how to use an interpreter, because what we saw is the interpreter basically taking over. And it's true, because as an interpreter myself, I know I can take over a conversation if I wanted to. I could tell people, even in English, I do it all the time. So shut up and let me talk.
And you wonder why you want to be on the panel.
You know, I was going to say that we interrupt each other all the time.
All the time. But what's interesting is that I could tell people where to sit. I could sit where I wanted to sit. I could watch a whole operation take place if I wanted to, and no one would tell me otherwise as an interpreter. So what we're trying to do is empower the service providers and let them know how to use an interpreter and the role of the interpreter. And that's why this next session after lunch, we have Jan Fried from KCC sitting over here. She'll be talking actually on the role of interpreter. And I think that will be a very beneficial thing. But once you know, you become empowered. For example, if there's conversations going on, you could say, excuse me, could you please interpret? And like not have a conversation. So there are tips to the trade, and I think Emmy Davison also will talk about, she has some tips to hand out about how to use an interpreter. But standards in the country are being formed, whether it be by nonprofit organizations or just even interpreters themselves in the medical field, of course in the courts. And the courts actually have taken a huge lead on standards, using quality interpreters in the courtroom, because it's obvious why, you know, they have to by law, but they have taken a lead, and they're a great lead to follow. And again, I think the next best thing coming up are the medical training and standards. So I would highly suggest that all of you know what those standards are. They're everywhere, all over the web, they're everywhere, standards in interpreting. But we need to get the interpreters trained as well as the service providers and people using interpreters.
And I just want to interject something. Sue's being kind, I think, because I'm a service provider and I'm sitting right next to her. But in addition to saying the interpreter did what, she also said the service provider did what? You what? Because inadvertently, as a service provider, we committed all kinds of errors. You know, it's very common to say to somebody, oh, can you find out from her when she's available for her next session? So we're really putting, as a service provider, putting the interpreter in a different role. She's now our scheduler, and that's really not her job. You know, or I would say, not me, of course, personally, but other service providers would say certain things like, oh, can you tell her that these are the services that are available, or these are her options? And really what I'm asking her to do, or setting her up to do, is to summarize, and then there's that opportunity to really get it messed up. So it's not just the interpreters that need to be trained, it's us service providers too.
And just, you know, so to sort of summarize, there really are two parts of interpreting, and one is the skill,